I'm Otis Corbett, and welcome to Corbett's Comments. The church is all about people. Of course, because people are frail and limited, that sometimes makes the church an interesting place to be. An old joke amongst missionaries is that mission service would be very enjoyable if it weren't for the local believers and the other missionaries. In another case, a pastor was preoccupied with thoughts about how he was going to, after the worship service, ask the congregation to come up with more money than they were expecting for repairs to the church building. And therefore he was annoyed to find that the regular organist was sick and that a substitute had been brought in at the last minute. As they discussed the worship service, the substitute wanted to know what music she should play. "Well, here's a copy of the service," the pastor said impatiently, "but you'll have to think of something to play after I make the announcement about the finances." Well, during the worship service, the minister paused and said, "Brothers and sisters, we are in great difficulty. The roof repairs cost twice as much as we expected, and we need $4,000 more. Any of you who can pledge $100 or more, please stand up." And at that moment, the substitute organist played the Star-Spangled Banner. And that's how the substitute organist became the regular organist. Now, I'm recording this in honor of Mother's Day, and we want to focus on some very important people of the church, namely women. And so today I'm commenting on some women in the New Testament whom we might call the mothers of the early church. As we do this, let's consider how they helped the infant church grow and mature in the first century. And as we begin, what we see is that in the early church, women helped seek God's guidance. Women helped seek God's guidance. Now, in the first century, women were not considered equal with men in society. They had to be related to a man in some way, and they could not act on their own. They were not even allowed to worship alongside men in the Jewish synagogue, for example. Women sat in the rear of the sanctuary, usually behind a screen of some type. Now, this attitude towards women still exists in many places today. While we were missionaries in Africa, one of our workers was a Muslim woman who had to remarry against her will. She was a mature lady with adult children, but when her husband died, she was required to marry another man whom she'd never met because she was not allowed to live outside the authority of a husband. Now, in the case of the early church, however, we see a radical difference, and this is revealed in Acts chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, and also verse 26. These passages read, "When the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day walk from the city, when they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. They all joined together constantly in prayer along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Then they cast lots," verse 26 says, "and the lot fell on Matthias, and so he was added to the apostles." It's fascinating to me that in this passage we see men and women praying together and consulting together. We apparently even see women deciding about calling a new apostle. And this shows a radical change in understanding of the role of women in the church or in the congregation. And although many see the church as discriminating against women, what we actually see is that the church is on the cutting edge in empowering women. Women were not even allowed to vote in the United States until 1920, but women were involved in deciding the course of the church right from the very start. We also see that in the early church, women received God's mercy. Women received God's mercy. If sin is an equal opportunity killer, then it is good to see that mercy knows no gender. We know that Jesus did very many miracles for men. For example, we know that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and he caused a blind man to see. But we also know that he did many miracles for women as well. The woman with the issue of blood who touched the hem of his cloak was healed, as was Jairus' daughter. And so the application of mercy did not end with the founding of the church either. And this is clearly demonstrated in Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 41. These verses say, "In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. And about that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room." Lydia was near Joppa, and so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydia, they sent 2 women to him and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and the other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room, and then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said to her, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. And then he called the believers, especially the women, and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Now, Dorcas was a disciple who was known for her good works and her charity. She fell ill and died, but God was not finished with her. He wanted to use her for his glory, and so he did. Now notice a couple of interesting points in this passage. First, Peter made sure that the widows were called so they could be encouraged and comforted. And this is a great example of pastoral care. Also, note that God did not simply want to bless Dorcas or to comfort the widows when he raised her from the dead. No, he used this event to bring glory to himself and to win souls to the cause of Christ. Dorcas was a channel for God's grace and mercy to be issued out for his glory. We also see in the early church that women helped spread the gospel. Women helped spread the gospel. As unusual as it was in the first century, God used a woman to bring the gospel to Europe. Let's look at this remarkable event in Acts chapter 16, verses 9 through 15. These verses say, "During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day, we went on to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those women was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. 'If you consider me a believer in the Lord,' she said, 'come and stay at my house.' And she persuaded us." The Macedonian call was a tipping point in church history. When Paul and Silas took the gospel into Macedonia, the church became a true intercontinental movement. This event took the gospel to Europe, and then it expanded across the oceans to arrive here in America. It continued to move on around the world until it arrived back in the Middle East. The spread of the gospel reminds me of a cartoon I saw once where a character threw a boomerang and it went around the entire world and came back and hit the character in the head from behind. This really fascinating thing about all this is that God began this revolutionary missionary endeavor in a unique way. Amazingly, the first European convert was a woman, And the first church planted outside of Asia was started in a woman's home. There is true equality before the Lord. Galatians 3:28 and 29 tells us, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Lydia is a prime example of the promise of God. Next, we see in the early church that women made disciples. Women made disciples. God calls on all people to become disciples. The Great Commission does not say to make converts. It does command us, however, to make disciples. And we're all called to salvation and to grow in the Lord. We're called to become mature people, not remaining babes in the Lord. And even more than that, mature believers are called to help the immature to grow. In this case, God called a woman, Priscilla, to help disciple a man named Apollos. Let's look at Acts chapter 18, verses 24 through 26. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, although he only knew of the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him more adequately the way of God. See, Apollos was what we call a loose cannon. He was a powerful orator, and he knew something of Jesus. And much of what he was so eloquently preaching about was wrong, however, because he had not actually been saved yet. This reminds me of a young man in my home church who surrendered to the ministry, but then he got saved. Like Apollos, he had the process backwards. Priscilla helped Apollos get saved, and then he helped disciple him. Now, discipling normally should be a same-gender exercise. In other scriptures, the older women are instructed to teach the younger women. In this case, Priscilla worked alongside Aquila, and God was able to use Apollos mightily after their instruction. Acts 18:27 and 28 tells us, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and the sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Finally, what we see is in the early church, women laid the foundation for faith in their homes. They laid the foundation for faith in their homes. As we consider this idea, we need to venture out of the book of Acts to the book of 2 Timothy. Now, Timothy was a protege of Paul and a valuable leader in the early church. As a young man, he responded to the call of God and became the pastor of an important church in Ephesus. And even though he was young, he was a man of great biblical knowledge who had a godly personality. As 2 Timothy 1:1-5 tells us, Timothy had a solid foundation in the faith, which was laid for him by his mother and his grandmother. Paul said, I thank God whom I serve, as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. As night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I might be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. In the family, both parents are responsible to God for their children, but mothers usually have more time with their children, and it is true that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. These women took advantage of their time with Timothy and not only taught him how to walk and how to talk and how to have manners, but also about God and the Scriptures. We must raise up our children in the way they should go. And these women obviously did that, and Paul commended them for it. Remember the old nursery rhyme that goes, here's the church, and here's the steeple. Open the doors, and here's the people. Well, in truth, the church is the people. Men, women, and children. In the passages above, we have seen how God used the women of the early church to grow it and mature it in the same way a parent grows and matures the children in their family. Each of these cases has much to teach us about the church today. The question is, have we learned our lessons? Thanks for watching. Every blessing, Dr. Otis Corbett.